let's get into our segment on the two. We've been going through Article 1, which is the legislative branch of the Constitution, which is, of course, the document that set up the federal government. This is the longest section by far. So we're going to be spending a number of shows on the Constitution, and I think this will be the third one for Article 1. And we're still not going to be through it by the end of this segment either. But we're hoping to be through Section 8 of Article 1. So Section 8, again, that's the one where it lists the powers of Congress. They're called enumerated powers, which means they list some specific powers. So on last week's show, I had gotten through Clause 5, or the first 5 parts of Section 8. So we're going to go through the rest of it today. So, actually, we went through the first 4 last week. So the first 4 again are number 1 was a taxing power. This was a big problem during the Articles of Confederation that wasn't working so well. So Congress got taxing power. They got power to borrow money. That was the second one. Third one is regulate commerce, which is Congress can regulate commerce with foreign nations, with the Indian tribes, and interstate commerce, which means commerce among the states. And then finally, Clause 4 was on immigration and bankruptcy. Immigration is like how you become a legal citizen of the United States. That's called naturalization, so that's actually the word that they used in Clause 4. So, continuing on with Clause 5 then. This is on money and standards, like weight and measure standards. We had talked before about under the Articles of Confederation, each state had their own money and their own standards, and how this was hurting the overall economy of the country at the time, because you basically had 13 separate state economies, and it was just creating havoc. So Congress set up the money, the printing of money and the coining of money, although back then it was more coining of gold and silver coins. They gave that power to Congress, and they took it away from the states. So this is a way that the Founding Fathers thought that we could try and unite the country more, by having like one economy rather than 13 separate ones. Therefore, now Congress had the power, but since that time they created the Federal Reserve Bank. So that's the central bank of the United States, and they're the ones now that do the money. But Congress now, they're the entity that has the power to print the money and print the coins. So if you take out a $1 bill or a $5 bill or even a coin, you can see on there, I'll just use a dollar bill as an example. You'll see at the top of it, that it says Federal Reserve Note up there on the top, and it says the United States of America on the front of the bill. There's also a sentence on there saying, quote, "This note is legal tender for all debts, public and private," close quote. So that you will see those on all the paper money. And then at the bottom, it'll say whatever the denomination is. So it'll say $1 or $20 or $10 or whatever it is. So you'll see that on each paper bill that you have. On the coins, you see the United States of America on there, as well as what the denomination is printed on the coin. So Congress has the power to do that. They also have the power to regulate the value of the money. So, they're the ones that print, well, this piece of paper is worth $1, or this piece of paper is worth $20, or this piece of paper is worth $1,000. Whatever it is, they can regulate the value of the money. And they also regulate the value of foreign coins. So Congress back in the 1800s, this is when they first started passing laws about this. The coins back then from foreign countries were typically gold and silver. And what Congress did is they looked at how many grains were used to make the coins, and then that's kind of how they decided what the coin was worth. So they could regulate, how much United States money is based, versus the foreign coin. And they fixed the standards of weight and measures. So in 1838, Congress adopted the English system of weights and measures as our national standard. So here we're talking about things like, this is how we ended up with pounds and ounces and gallons and miles and stuff like this. Congress adopted these standards. So that's what Clause 5 is about. Clause 6, this one you don't see used all that much anymore. But it allows the punishment of counterfeiters. So there still are people out there, of course, trying to counterfeit money. It's getting harder and harder to do, but there's certainly people out there trying to do it. So Congress was given the power to set the punishment. So right now, at least as what I could tell, the current maximum penalty for counterfeiting is 20 years in jail and a $250,000 fine under federal law. So if you're a counterfeiter, you definitely don't want to get caught, because you could be spending a long time in prison. But, that's the point of it, right? Clause number 7. This one is the one that gives power to Congress to establish post offices and post roads. Now, post roads means basically all the routes that the mail is transported on these days. So it wasn't just like roads like it was at one point, but now it's airplanes, right, boats, any sort of transportation that carries the mail these days. So Congress has the right to establish the post offices or take them away, for that matter, and then the post roads. So just a fun fact here: Abraham Lincoln, when he was in the House of Representatives for one term, 1847 to 1849, and one of the bills he got passed was dealt with post roads. So Congress has the power to do this. So this is why the post office is run by the federal government. Clause number 8 is about patents and copyrights. So there's actually federal offices now that this is, if you want to get a patent or a copyright, you got to go through that office to do it. You got to fill out a bunch of forms and file it with this office, and then they look it over. So copyrights is basically stuff like if you write a book or you make a movie or things like that. You're an author of something. Generally, those last the life of the author plus another 70 years. Patents, those are for inventions that you have. So depending on what you invent, those patents last 14 to 20 years generally. So during that time frame is where you can, if you're the inventor, you can exclusively sell those products or whatever it is that you invent for that period of time. And then once that time is up, then it's basically the public can, or in other companies can start making, your stuff, basically. So, but you do have usually between 14 and 20 years to make all the money you can off of that, your invention. So that's Clause 8. Clause 9 gives the Congress the power to set up the federal court system underneath the Supreme Court. So we'll see in Article 3 of the Constitution, which deals with the judicial branch, it actually says in there that the Supreme Court is going to be established. So the Constitution itself does that. It also says in Article 3 that Congress is going to set up the rest of the federal court system. So it actually says it in two places. So it says that in Article 3, as well as here in Article 1, Clause 9. So this was something that the first Congress did in 1789. There was a Judiciary Act that they passed, and the Congress has been changing it ever since. So Minnesota has 4 federal courts. There's one in Minneapolis, there's one in St. Paul, there's one in Duluth, and there's one in Fergus Falls. And Minnesota is in the 8th Circuit for the Court of Appeals cases. So if you you go to one of these 4 district courts and then you want to appeal your case, you have to. Minnesota is part of the 8th Circuit, so that's the federal court circuit. You'll be in the United States right now has 13 circuit courts. So we're in number 8 here in Minnesota. Clause 10, this is definitely one that isn't used a whole lot anymore. This is where Congress had the power to punish piracy and felonies committed on the oceans and offenses against the law of nations. Now, when they say law of nations, what they're talking about there is international law. Okay, so, back then when the United States first started, there was a lot of piracy and stuff going on the oceans. And this was one of the reasons why we ended up in the War of 1812 with England again, is because they started seizing our ships and stealing our sailors. Right? So this gave Congress the power to deal with piracy and other crimes that occurred on the oceans. And then Congress has the power to have the punishment for violations of international law. Clause 11 gives Congress the power to declare war. Now, there's somewhat of a common misconception that the president is the one that declares war. That's not the case. Congress is the one that declares war. And then when Clause 11 was first written, it also gave private parties the power to seize enemy ships during wartime. Although that part isn't used anymore because that's banned under international law, and the United States honors that. So that part isn't really at play here anymore. But Congress is the one to declare war, not the president. Although it sure seems like it's the president these days. So, Brett, here's a little quiz for you. When do you think the United States, when was the last time they declared war?
Oh, formally declared war?
Yeah.
I gotta say, it wasn't even Vietnam. I might go all the way back to World War II.
You're correct. Yes, it was World War II. We didn't do it in Korea or Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan. Since World War II, what has happened is Congress has passed something typically called the continuing resolutions, authorizing the use of force. Sometimes they'll call it authorization for use of force. That's what they've been using. So there's some people who are complaining that the Congress needs to take back its war declaration power because nowadays the president pretty much can do what he wants. And I'll be talking about that in a future show, too. But, yeah, World War II was the last time Congress formally declared war. Clause 12 is about the power to raise and support armies because, again, remember, under the Constitution or the Articles of Confederation, we didn't have a national army. So an interesting part, though, of Clause 2 is that appropriation limit is 2 years. So Congress every 2 years has to relook at the budget for the armed forces. They can only do the budget for 2 years. So that's kind of an interesting thing because they were a little skeptical of having a national army back then. So Clause 13 deals with the creation of the Navy. And then in 1947, Congress created the Air Force. So there's not a section in here, of course, in the Constitution about the Air Force because there weren't any planes back then. But so Congress, by a congressional law, created the Air Force, which is basically covered under these same rules. Clause 14 is the regulation of the armed forces, which basically says Congress gets to make the rules for all of the military branches. So one of the things, an example of this would be Congress adopted a Uniform Code of Military Justice in 1950. So there's a separate military courts in the United States that deal with the military branches. Clause 15 is about the militia, although it's not really called the militia anymore. It's called the National Guard now. where Congress can call forth the National Guard to execute the laws of the United States, to suppress insurrections, and to repel invasions. So both Congress and the President have the power to do this with the National Guard. So that's Clause 15. Clause 16 is about how the militia, again, we're talking about the National Guard now these days, how it's organized. So basically what this does is when Congress or the President calls the National Guard to be under the power of the national government, the National Guard is subject to the same rules Congress has set for the regular military. Clause 17, we're getting close to the end now, 2 left. Clause 17 establishes Washington, D.C. So Congress controls Washington, D.C. Now, Congress gave Washington, D.C. some of its own power, so there is a city government of Washington, D.C., but the federal government controls it. That's why the federal government is in Washington, D.C., because they put this in Clause 17. So Congress actually passed a law in 1791 to start setting it up and starting building stuff and things like that there. So there is a movement to try and make Washington, D.C. a state. This would essentially give the Democrats 2 more Senate seats because this is the Democrats basically control Washington, D.C. at the city government level. So, but Congress still regulates it, and sometimes you hear about fights, between usually it's the Republicans in Congress versus the Washington, D.C. city government. So, you're probably going to hear more about this, especially if the Democrats win, sweep the elections in November, as you might see a movement to try and get Washington, D.C. and probably Puerto Rico to be states. Finally, we get to Clause 18, so this is the final one in Section 8. And this is one of the more important ones, I think. It's called the Necessary and Proper Clause, or sometimes you'll hear it be called the Elastics Clause. I call it the Catch-All Clause sometimes. So I'm just going to read it for you here. So it says, quote, to make all laws which are necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, which means the foregoing 17 clauses, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof, close quote. So notice that this doesn't contain any specific powers, but this is a very important one because Congress uses this all the time. Because Congress does a lot of things that aren't specifically listed in the 17 previous clauses. And the way they do it is under Clause 18. Because then they say, well, we got to do this program or set up this other agency or whatever it is to relate to our, one of our powers and clause, the 17 clauses. So this allows Congress to adapt the government to its changing needs and changing times. So as long as Congress can stretch it a little bit to reach some of those powers in the 17 previous clauses, they can do it. So one of the examples is a national bank. We don't have a national bank now. Really, we have the Federal Reserve System, but back then, then I read all the previous 17 clauses, and none of them said anything about a bank. But the Supreme Court ruled that, well, under the Necessary and Proper Clause, Congress needs a bank to deposit its tax revenues it collects, to pay debts, to coin the money, all those sorts of things. Is that you need a bank to do that. So the Supreme Court allowed it. So now we have finally come to the end of Section 8.